Let's see. We start off with Jesus arriving at Jerusalem. He arrives at the Feast of the Jews, which appears to be Passover. It's not absolutely clear whether it is, but if you look in, and we don't have to turn this up, but if you look in Leviticus 23, there's a margin note there that directs us to Leviticus 23. It's a list of a lot of feasts. We've got the Sabbath, Passover, unleavened bread. We've got the Feast of the Trumpets, the Atonement, Tabernacles. But looking at all those, it seems to be that it probably is Passover is the reason that Jesus went to Jerusalem. We see in verse 2 there, it says, "Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches." So we can take a look at the time of Nehemiah. Gives us a good picture of where that sheep market, also called the sheep gate, was. Let's see. It's right about there. And that's significant when Jerusalem was rebuilt, when the wall was rebuilt, and that's covered in Nehemiah 3. The sheep gate was the first gate reconstructed, and that was around the 5th century BC. A different look at it in Jesus' time, and you can see there's quite a bit more that had been constructed in that period of time. But if you look, to orient ourselves, if you look up here, right up there, that's the pool that we're talking about today, where the man was. And I have one last slide here that shows you what it actually looks like there. So there you can see the water in the center and the porches. And the sheep gate is significant because that's where the sheep were brought through for the sacrifice at Passover. Bethesda, it means the house of mercy. It also means flowing water. So here we have in this construction a place where people can go. There's God's mercy there of healing, and the water flows through, and it is churned up, and the people that are there who believe then can be healed. So around this, around the pool, we see in verse 3. It says, "In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water." So you can imagine from this picture just all kinds of people standing around the pool, waiting for that water to be troubled, for it to be churned up. And troubled in the next, in verse 3, it's referred to as moving of the water. If we move on to verse 4, it says, "For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whosoever then first, after the troubling of the water, stepped in, was made whole of whatsoever disease that he had." You look at that word troubled, which is also moving of the water. In verse 3, troubled is, in Strong's, it's 5015, which means to agitate. So the water would be churned up by that angel. Verse 5 tells us, "And a certain man," this is the man who had an infirmity for 38 years, he was there waiting. Moving into verse 6, it says, "When Jesus saw him lie and knew that he had been now a long time in that case." So Jesus approaches this scene. There's a lot of people around waiting for the water to be churned up. Jesus sees this man who is having difficulty. Asks him, "Wilt thou be made whole?" Which seems, at first glance, a question. Christ is asking him a question if he wants to be made whole. Looking at Young's literal translation, though, he says, "Dost thou wish to become whole?" So it's not a question per se. It's really formed more as it's an offer in the form of a question. Do you want me to help you? Is really what he's saying to the man. Moving on to verse 7, "The impotent man answered him, Sir, I have no man when the water is troubled to put me into the pool. But while I am coming, another stepped down before me." So here we have a perfect example of what a trap that we can so easily fall into. He's waiting there. He's obviously had trouble making his way up. There's some ramps there, and you can see some steps. He's obviously gone through a lot to get there, and he's just not able to make that last bit of distance to get to the pool. And his response is that there's no man to help him. He's relying on man rather than putting his faith in God. Actually, we came across this very same idea in yesterday's reading of the Psalms. If you want to flip back to that quickly. Psalm 118 and verse 8. And contrary to what the Psalm told this man, he had, as I said, he was putting himself in man's hands. Psalm 118 verse 8 tells us it's better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. So maybe that's why he was having so much trouble. Anyway, Christ came along to offer him that help. The other side of this, as we can see, is not only the man this man was relying on other men to help him, but these other men weren't helping him. They weren't helping him at all. Clearly he was having trouble, but people just kept stepping past him and taking care of themselves, the selfishness of the flesh right there. And for another reference, we can look at, and I know that we're all familiar with this, if you flip back to Mark 12 and verse 31, this is the scene where if you recall, it was the Pharisees and Sadducees posed a question to Jesus about the woman with 7 husbands and whose wife was she in the kingdom. And Jesus then goes on to clarify for them in verse 29. And Jesus answered them, "First of all, the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength, and with all thy mind." This is the first commandment. And the second is what we're looking at this morning. The second is namely this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There is none other commandment greater than these. So clearly these people were, this was not a good situation. Not only was the man relying on the wrong party to assist him, but the people were not doing as the scriptures tell them either. So after all of this, Jesus turns to him very simply in verse 8. Jesus saith unto him, "Rise, take up thy bed and walk." And just as we've seen in other miracles where he's healed someone who's had an infirmity, who's unable to walk, perhaps from birth or from some other situation, it's simply a word. It's Christ saying, "Rise and walk." And it's done. And the man is fine. There's no period after where he gradually rehabilitates. No, he's fine at that point. The healing power of God. And immediately the man was made whole and took up his bed and walked. Walk there, in both of those verses, is Strong's 4043, which means to walk, but it also means to make use of opportunities. So this whole situation, this truly was an opportunity for this man to go out and preach the word, to tell people about the miracle that Christ had done for him. And like this man, we see things similar to this, which strengthens our faith. And these are also an opportunity for us to go out, walk, tell each other. It's an opportunity for us to tell other people about the Word of God. So we see at the end of verse 9 there, after the man took up his bed and walked, and on the same day was the Sabbath. So this is the end of the week. And this whole passage really at that point, at this point it turns from, healing and miracle and grace, salvation, all of that, it turns to a scene of contention, which we see there in verse 10. The Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, so they've seen the man has up and left the pool, and they must have known who he was. They confronted him right there, stating it's the Sabbath day, it's not lawful for thee to carry thy bed, which is working. So we can see what they're referring to here if we go back to Exodus 20 and 10, which, as you know, is the listing of the commandments. So verse 10 clarifies for us, and this is the fourth commandment, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, etc. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So it's the day when, and that's where these Jews, they're off track because they're not understanding the spirit of what it is. You're supposed to rest from man's work. So we can understand their premise, but they're getting caught up again in the law, those finite things, rather than the spirit of it. Verse 11, he answered them, He that made me whole, the same said unto me, Take up thy bed and walk. Then they asked him, What man is it, that which said unto thee, Take up thy bed and walk? So they've passed right by the miracle that Jesus did. They've completely ignored it. It didn't even register. They just wanted to know who this was, who had done this, who had instructed him to work, as they say, on this day, on the Sabbath day. So the man tells them that he doesn't know who it was. He wist not who it was, for Jesus had conveyed himself away, a multitude being in that place. So wist just means did not know. And you can imagine that the reason that Jesus had left is he had done this miracle, and that really, that got people's attention. So they crowded around him, probably, and he fled from that scene. In verse 14, some time has gone by. We're not sure how much time had passed. Probably a couple of hours. But it certainly was the same day. Jesus found him in the temple and said unto him, Behold, thou art made whole. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee. So this man was doing, he had returned to the temple. He was doing what is supposed to be done on the Sabbath. There's some guidelines of what can be done on the Sabbath day. Of course, it starts at sundown and it goes right through sundown on the following day. They should of course refrain from work. They can partake in 3 meals. They might visit the synagogue at least once during that period. So this man was probably following that. After being healed, he was probably going there to give thanks for what had been done to him. And Christ says to him, Sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee. Worst thing, part of that is actually certain. The word thing is actually certain. And come unto, which means be performed. So Christ is reminding him, now that this was done to him, he has a higher level of knowledge, he has a higher level of understanding, telling him to sin no more or suffer a worse thing. Then paralysis. It's hard to imagine what's worse than paralysis for 38 years. We, of course, know that with this knowledge, a worse thing is certain death. So moving into 15, the man has now left the temple. He's departed, and he either sought out the Jews who had confronted him earlier after he'd been healed, or he ran into them. He departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus which made him whole. And then 16 seems to be the tipping point for, Christ's life up to that point. He had done, miracles and things to really agitate the leaders of the Jews. And this seemed to be the tipping point. Therefore, did the Jews persecute Jesus and sought to slay him because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. But Jesus answered them, "My Father worked hitherto, and I work." So to me, it's kind of strange that Christ has done these things and they would persecute him because he's really doing God's work. Of course, they obviously didn't understand that at the time. They were so focused on the law rather than the principle. They didn't understand that he was actually doing God's work. But Jesus answered them, I read that, "My Father worked hitherto, and I work." That hitherto means at this time. So my Father works at this time, and I work. And this is, of course, a perfect example for us. The rules of men really were conflicting with God's instruction. So, of course, Christ followed God. He understood what the principles that God had laid forth, and he refused to follow man's laws when they conflicted with God's word. So that's it. Questions, comments? Steve?
I had a couple of thoughts. One is the overall picture here is very, very interesting in Jesus' relationship with this man, because when he told him to pick up your bed and walk, Jesus knew it was the Sabbath day. And he knew, being where they were, that it was quite likely that this gentleman was going to run into trouble. And I think this is a form of test. And I think after the conversation that he had the first time, who told you to carry it? The man obviously knew that whoever told him was in trouble. So it wasn't like he said, he's been innocently and said, "Oh, but it was Jesus who healed him, Jesus Nazareth." I think he was probably in a measure of trouble himself, and so he basically passing the buck. When Jesus comes to him and says, "Sin no more," I think that's an indicator to not go and follow through this thought that he has in his mind, which he acts on. As soon as Jesus leaves him, he's up and he's going, and he goes to tell them. And the repercussion of that, of course, is that Jesus is persecuted, and that whole trouble begins. So it seems to be like this man was healed, yes, but that wasn't the end of the story. It was a development of character, which appears to me, I could be wrong, but it appears like his character really wasn't properly developed. But we can see Jesus working with him. It's almost like he set him up, right? Pick up your bed and walk. And so that there would be a measure of conflict in this man's life, which he would have to resolve. Unfortunately, he resolved it in the wrong way. But someone said, "It wasn't me, it was this guy over here that told me to do it," which, again, got Jesus in trouble. And Jesus comes to him again and says, "Hey, think about what you're doing." And the worst thing may not be a physical disability. You were paralyzed before. I didn't even be paralyzed or anything like that, but rather puts himself in a situation of condemnation, basically. I think that makes any sense. And the other thing is verse 4, the perception of what happened or what happened? I think there's a big difference. Because to me, it almost seems like if we accept this on the surface as being, well, an angel comes down and troubles the water, and whoever gets there first, that sounds like a lottery. That doesn't sound like the way that God works. But if there was something that an underground spring or whatever that would trouble out the wind, and this is the perception of it, kind of like a
the angel's appearance was the perception.
Right, exactly. And then say, well, whoever gets there first, kind of like going through, I can see the mentality of the faith healers, you know what I mean, as opposed to this, an actual healing. Jesus comes along, performs an actual healing. Obviously, right at that particular moment in time. And there's a whole bunch of details that I think are very, very interesting. I don't know all the answers to, but obviously the sheep gate, the fact that he was 38 years old, the fact that he couldn't walk and no one would help, all these things kind of enter into that, why Jesus was there at that particular time. But just, it seems incongruous to me with our understanding of the way God works to say that, an angel came down, stirred up the water, and then stood back and waited to see who was going to get there first. It doesn't seem to be the way God works.
RSV doesn't even put it in there.
Huh?
RSV doesn't even put it in Scripture. They don't have a verse 4.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Most other translations say it was said instead of for.
Right. Which seems to make sense that they would see something natural would occur in that pool. Like Old Faithful, something stirs up that water, some hot spring or something. This is something.
Right.
And this poor guy, like you said, it is interesting too, the fact that there's just no one's here to help me. And in my mind, I go back to the friends who opened up the roof and let their friend down through to put him in the presence of Jesus. They were there to help that man, right? And this guy didn't have anybody. If I don't have anybody to help me, I think the point is Jesus was there. That's what we should have relied on, right?
That may be why exactly he was there.
Exactly. But then, Jesus doesn't just heal him. He could have just healed him and said, now go to the temple and do the feast or whatever it does. Just take up your bed on the Sabbath day and walk. It's not like Jesus didn't know that would put this man in a position of compromise. It almost seems like it's that conversation, it's that interaction after the miracle that is the real lesson of the story. What happened to this gentleman, and unfortunately
in the temple later on.
Right, exactly. Yeah, from that time when the Jews came to him and he said, well, it's obviously he's in trouble, and he said, I don't know who did it. I don't know who told me to do that. And again, he would have understood from that whoever did tell him would be in trouble. You know what I mean? So when he went and told them, when he said, Jesus healed me, he basically said, he's the one that told me to break the Sabbath. Which I think he probably could have had. There's something different he should have done. That makes sense. Because the healing was his introduction to Christ, and everything afterward would be his reaction. It's kind of like when we come to an understanding of the truth. It's everything afterward that is your reaction to that. That's your interaction with Christ. And I think that's what we speak here. And there's got to be a lesson. There's got to be a reason. I don't know the answer why he's 38 years old. It wouldn't be in there. If there wasn't something about him being 38 years old, or having this problem of 38 years.
It's the same lesson that we had with when Christ came and healed. There was a madman in their synagogue, and then he heals Peter's mom in the house, Peter's mother-in-law in the house. That was a picture of what was going on in Israel.
Right.
They were mad in their synagogue. Their doctrine was impure from the platform. And in their houses at home, they were sick. They were ill because of that. Mm-hmm. So it's a parable of what's going on in Israel. It's the same here for 38 years. That's how that represents Israel. Israel was lame on their feet, 38 years in the wilderness, wandering.
Okay, so you're saying, from the 2 years to get to Sinai and then 38 years. Okay.
Yeah, so that 38 years parallels Israel to this man. And then the fact that Christ was a compassionate man. It wasn't like, he was in control, but he was very compassionate. And that's part of the reason why he left so quickly. All these sick people around, and he had to control his compassion in the sense that he had to get out of there. Because he came to do he looked for that one man, 38 years sick. He represents Israel. Heals them, leaves. Now they need to go find him, and it's sort of a living parable in that sense. Right?
Jesus finds him in the temple too, which is interesting. What Steve thought, that he's not seeking out Christ to follow him. Right? I mean, Christ goes and finds him to talk to him again.
It almost seems like he's encouraging the man to do what's right.
Yeah.
So there's something to that. I mean, I don't know how it would fit into what you're saying, but obviously, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, it just came and then he was gone. So that's maybe 80, 70s. It's no more. I don't know.
Michelle?
I just think it's odd. All these people are there to be healed. You don't hear about anybody being healed except this one man. Nobody even acknowledges it. And that's kind of like in the world. You turn to God. The world's waiting to be helped too. But they're not looking in the right
But they
place.
can't see it, right?
And I see that in the story. The one person was healed. They didn't even see it.
It goes back to Chris's comment too about the people worrying about themselves. They're still looking for how to get themselves, the way they want to be, looking at, for the movement of the water or whatever. The people are there not even seeing Christ, which is right there doing a miracle for someone else.
Right, they're relying on a fable of an angel coming down and stirring the water up, and rains on healing, and that's not
There was probably so intent on that water, they didn't see what happened.
right.
The question's also asked, are you willing to be healed? I think that's the question to Israel. Here's your Messiah. Are you willing to believe? Are you willing to have faith? Do you have faith in this or not? Are you going to continue wandering in the wilderness for more than 38 years in a sense?
Because that instant when he did heal him, that was nothing more than an instant. That was the beginning of his healing.
Yeah.
I think is what you're saying.
Yeah. Showing that Jesus was the Lord of the Sabbath, and that's where he starts the whole. He's always showing what the point of the Sabbath is, like he said. Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Right?
Right. Anything else? How much time do we have?
10 minutes.